Yeah. Was that with the sheriff's department or police department or? Oh, okay. All right. Great. Any other reactions or questions or anything? I will forewarn you that next Monday we'll have our next speaker. It's another friend of mine, Doug Feil. He's going to be talking about dissociation, and we're going to be really full because I can't. Saxby noticed, as you guys probably did too. Well, you didn't because you got to. Well, no, you did. Watching a video is a little tough to engage with because John had come and spoken to the Tuesday class, and so and Saxby kind of found the same problem with his crisis and trauma class, which is at the same time as this one. So since Doug is going to be coming on Monday, he's going to bring his whole class down here. So we will be packed. And probably people will probably be on the floor or whatever. Just don't rat us out to the fire marshal or anything. But it's probably the only way to make it so that only one class gets impacted with the whole video thing. And so that's next week. 2 weeks out from there, we will have a detective from Lakewood Police Department come. And if I can figure out how that goes, she may come a couple of days, one on a Tuesday and then another one on a Wednesday, which would be this class. So we'll find a way to kind of make it so that you guys can personally see these people as much as we possibly can. It's not ideal. It's a tall ask for a lot of these folks to ask them to come 2 days in a row. And it's not like I have this massive budget that I can pay them some money to come. So it's out of the goodness of their hearts that they're spending the time with us. So, but that's going to be next week, and it will be it'll be full in here, but it's been full in here before. So, any other questions or anything? Okay, well, we're about a day behind from the other class, which is no big deal. I think I mentioned when we left off was this is when it comes to talking about crisis and trauma, probably the two major issues that I have decided to bring into these classes that I haven't in the past is one, talking about boundaries. I have had a lot of people that I've read journals where they've said, I'm afraid that I'm going to take this home with me. I've had a lot of people ask me, how in the world have you done it for as long as you have? And I'd say the secret is boundaries and understanding boundaries. The other one is safe people, which I apologize to all you guys that are in Shame and Grace. You've heard this one again. It never hurts to be reminded, I don't think, maybe in quick succession. There are probably some things you'll notice that maybe you didn't the other way. Again, part of this is the reasoning behind me doing this with these two subjects, in spite of the fact that a lot of you guys have seen it before, is that in this context they look very different. And the reality is that within the context of CCU, they look different. Because you have a decision every day about whether or not or how you will be a safe person for somebody that's in your life, whoever that is. And whether or not they've experienced trauma or whether they're in crisis or whatever that is, you have some very important decisions to make about how you're going to come alongside somebody and just what that's going to look like. And the one thing I want you to keep in mind is that our tendency when we're pressed, somebody asks us a question, how could God do this? Or why is this happening? Or things like that. When we get pressed, we will go to what we know. We will not go to what we learn. Okay? So you can say, well, I've been through this material. I know all about it. No, you don't. Not until you sit with somebody and they are feeling in the depths of depression or they're feeling chaotic and confused inside, and what we end up doing is what is reflexive to us, and that's where the problem then comes in. And so, as I've said to you guys before, if I want to try to make some changes, I have to start with developing some level of awareness of what's going on at first. And then, once I have some awareness of that, identifying what I actually do, and then starting to make some changes and doing some things differently. That's the cycle of change, okay? Is awareness, identification, the actual action of some sort, and then evaluation. And then you start all over again. That's the cycle. And ultimately, when it comes right down to it, in crisis and trauma, they talk about short-term counseling, one-session counseling, and long-term. That still is in there. All four of those things are in there. Except they are compressed in the short-term or one-session kind of counseling. That tends to be a lot more focused on immediate needs than long-term is. And John kind of made that distinction between being an advocate and then being a therapist. And therapists struggle with that because we don't tend, those of us that have been doing therapy for a long time, we don't tend to think of immediate needs, because most of the time the people we see have already had their immediate needs taken care of. So we're not very practiced at thinking in those terms. And that's why I'm bringing this material to you, just to get you thinking. And I don't want you to think about, somewhere in the future that probably this material will be applicable later this afternoon when you sit down and have a cup of coffee with somebody. It will be that relevant. And if you can make it that way, then you can take it into the other discussions we're going to have around the whole crisis and trauma stuff, okay? So there's the introduction. Let me pray to get us started, and then we'll start with the boundary stuff. Father, thank you for a weekend to get refreshed and to get clear and recharge our batteries to be able to start up another week. I pray that with the start of today and into the week that our hearts would be oriented and move toward what you're bringing us to, the things that you want us to pay attention to. Help us to be open and willing to look at that, even if it's a little uncomfortable. At the same time, trusting your heart that you wouldn't be bringing it to us now if it wasn't for what we needed and what you perceived we need and we need to respond to. So help us do that individually, and then also help us learn to come alongside people we care about and people that just enter our lives, so we can help them and empower them to be the people that you've created them to be. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so whenever I talk about boundaries, I usually like to talk about fences. Partly because most people, for one, this is not a conversation a lot of people have had. And yes, I tend to beat the drum on this one. I had one student who was graduating and commented about how sick she was of hearing about boundaries for all of the years that she was here at CCU. But that being the case, even so, it doesn't make it any less important. And it really, what we have to talk about is, what is your fence around? And namely, the short answer is your heart. But we need to expand that understanding. So what I have for you, a lot of you guys have seen this already, is a video from some production guys that had a little bit too much time on their hands. What's portrayed, this video was not developed to make a point about boundaries, but what is portrayed is people that are only trying to help, okay? And so they have all the motivations figured out about why they want to help. And that's the key here. And what kind of behaviors tend to occur as a result of that. And when somebody starts to question those motives, what do we do? What's our reaction to them? Okay? So here is this video. Like I said, some of you guys have probably got this memorized, but tough.
It's made possible by a grant from the Fake British Accent Guild and viewers like you. Meet Greg Samaritan, a man like many men in this world, occasionally feeling the pressure of living up to the standards put upon him by his father and his father's father and so on. Or does it go deeper than that? We recently sat down with Greg and asked him about his heritage.
I am of the direct lineage of the Good Samaritan. Actually, my great grandfather was the Good Samaritan that Jesus talks about in the Bible. The story goes that a man was beaten and robbed by the side of the street and left to die. My great grandfather then came upon this man on the side of the road and decided to help him. You want?
Hey, Greg.
I'm sorry, I can't help it. Just saw this kind of messy right here.
Being a good Samaritan at all times to all people, it turns out, can become quite taxing.
I'm basically a nice guy. I care about others. But I'd like a little time for myself.
That's good.
You know? Because every day I'm doing at least 4 or 5 good deeds when I could be enjoying my time other ways. I guess it's in my blood. I don't really have a choice. I find myself in situations where I need to help others, and I oblige. I follow what my great grandfather did before me. No problem. No problem. I've got some time, and I'd love to help. So, actually, you know what? She was before me. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Seriously, go ahead. Yeah, no problem. No problem. I don't even know what I want yet. If I could just have one day a week where I could be selfish and worry about me, have some me time, you know, and take the phone off the hook because people call me all the time wanting to. Hold on a second. Sorry, I just got to take this. Hello? Oh, hey. No, that's no problem. I'll be right there. It's my friend Tom, and he's moving today.
I decided it was time to challenge some of Greg's assumptions about his heritage.
Have you ever heard of a parable?
Sure.
It's a story that Jesus often told to make his point. And from what the Bible says, the Good Samaritan is a parable. It's a story.
What are you saying?
Well, it's a story that Jesus told. It's not something that actually happened in the Bible per se. Are you aware that that's true?
Hold on. Are you trying to tell me that my great grandfather is not a real person? Do you want to see my driver's license? It says Greg Samaritan. It's my last name.
I mean, all this time you could have been doing whatever you wanted. You chose to do this.
You know what? I choose to end this interview. This interview's over. Do you want some tea or anything? I have some cold cuts. I can make you a sandwich.
It wasn't easy for him to hear, but Greg chose to move on with his life and forever put away the assumption that he must, by blood, be a good Samaritan. Our film crew caught up with Greg a week later to follow his progress.
Greg, Mr. Samaritan.
No cameras.
Mr. Samaritan.
No cameras. Get that out of my
I
face.
just want to take a picture. Just a picture.
You'll see what I'm really like.
Over to Jericho.
So I promise you will never see it again this semester. How's that? For you guys that have been in Shame and Grace, you've already seen this more times than you care to. The thing I want you to point out to you in that video is Greg says, that's my name. And what jumps out to me is a lot of times that's exactly how we justify a lot of behavior that crosses boundaries because we're Christians. That's what Christians do. So substitute Christians for Samaritan, and you got a video that gets pretty uncomfortable pretty quickly. I guess it's just in my blood. I've got to do it this way. Irrespective of whether or not he was even asked, he goes up to somebody's desk, tidies up their desk without even asking them. I just can't help myself. And see, suddenly this video gets a little convicting because it gets closer and closer to our tendency to take it upon ourselves to figure out what other people need without even bothering to ask. Now, they may not be able to answer, but that's not the point. The point is they have a right to choose what they respond to with their needs, not us divine it and then tell them what it is they need. And that happens a lot. We think that's being sensitive. And we even think that's being perceptive. And in a lot of cases, sometimes it is, but I'd rather err on the side of empowering them to own their own needs by asking. And that's part of what we have to talk about even when we talk about being safe people. So with boundaries in the physical world, you see them everywhere. You see boundaries in terms of fences and walls. I don't think anybody has any moats these days. But the same way with lawns. I mean, some people are really very, very fastidious about their lawns. Why? Because it's theirs. It's their property. It's a reflection of them. And so we have things on a regular basis, even in the world around us, that portray this. So in the spiritual world, the boundaries that we have define our soul. Proverbs 4:23, watch over your heart. Some translations render that guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the well springs of life. You will hear me refer to this verse a lot because of how we see change in ourselves even. And our tendency is to not pay attention to the well. Our tendency is to pay attention to downstream from the well, which is what our behavior is. Our behavior flows from what's going on in the well. That's why the writer of Proverbs makes this such a big deal. And that's why it's part of even boundaries. Being clear about what I'm responsible for and what I am not. Okay? So they define me and not me. The way I experience, whether it's bitterness or whether it's joy or whether it's confusion, everybody experiences that differently. Some people experience it more physically. Some people experience it more in the emotional realm with certain things that indicate to them that is what they're feeling. So I'm the only one. And the thing that's really tough, I think, when we come alongside people and what John talked about in being an advocate, he mentioned a number of times for their purpose being to follow, not lead. In other words, the person defines what's going on, then they come alongside and follow along with that, rather than being a diagnostician and figuring out what they need. And that's the key here, is the only person who is an expert about your emotions is you. There's nobody else that's an expert on that. And if I can figure that out, then I will ask a question rather than perceive. Because that perception, whatever that perception is that I have of you, is usually pretty flawed. It's usually defined only by what I think is important rather than what you think is important. And that's a very important part of this process when we're talking about it. So The other thing to keep in mind is what I refer to as the boulders and backpacks verse in Galatians, because Paul uses two different words that I think are important to pay attention to. Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens, for in so doing you fulfill the law of Christ. And that's the first one. And the Greek word for burden is boulder. Something so big, so crushing, somebody cannot possibly carry it alone. They may think they can, or even worse, they may think they should be able to, but it's still a part of the landscape. And then three verses later, he says, for each one should bear his own load. Load, literally, in the Greek, when you look at it, says knapsack. It's a backpack. And our backpacks are the things that we carry for our daily responsibilities, the things in there. We're not carrying things for other people. We are carrying our own stuff. And so, the question then is how do I be responsible to somebody, but not for somebody? Being responsible to somebody may be perceiving just how crushing the weight is that they're carrying and come alongside and carry it with them. Okay? That would be responsible to somebody. The other side of that is being responsible for somebody. Sometimes people carrying their own load complain and whine and moan about how terrible their lives are and how miserable the day is and everything else. And they want you to be responsible for them. And in a lot of cases, we're not doing anybody any favor. As a matter of fact, having boundaries is the most loving thing I can do for anyone. Being clear about what I'm responsible for and what I am not, and recognizing there is a time I need to be responsible to somebody else, which might be when it's a boulder carrying it with them, and might be when they're carrying their backpack saying, you can do it, and being a cheerleader rather than carrying it for them. And this is the toughest part of this one, when we talk about boundaries. Because being responsible to somebody might trigger some measure of discomfort in them. And we don't want that. As a matter of fact, we get to the point, particularly in the emotional realm, we get to the point where we're responsible for their emotions. And we manage their emotions by not doing certain things every bit as much as we do them. And that's violating boundaries. And that's why this is so important, because when we're talking about crisis and trauma, you have people that have been thrown into chaos. Their world has been turned upside down. All they thought was up is down, and all that's down is up. Everything is thrown into question. And our tendency is to try to fix it for them. And you got to be really careful, because it could be crossing boundaries and you're not really empowering them for the future. So coming alongside, asking questions, inviting them to identify what it is they need, even though they may struggle with whether or not it's legitimate to have needs, is really a part of being responsible to somebody else. I can't feel your feelings for you. See, prepositions really, really are very, very important. I can't feel them for you. A lot of people think they can, because that's the definition of loving somebody. Is that one person feels all these emotions and they feel it just like they do. And they think that's loving, and it isn't. It's fusing. It fuses with the other person. And before too long, because they're so uncomfortable, they start taking care of you rather than caring for their own heart. And there's a lot of this that is embedded in even our interactions with one another. So the other part of it is boundaries. Why do we have them? To keep the good in and the bad out. Most fences always have a gate in them. Otherwise, it's a prison. And the question is who is the gatekeeper? And if I'm going to think of my heart as my yard, let's just do that, because that's how I explain it even to my kids. Ironically, my kids are now in their 20s and 30s, and they still use that against one another. Get the heck out of my yard. But the yard is my heart. And the fence around that yard is how I care for it. It helps me to delineate what's me and what's not me. What is my heart? What is my responsibility? What isn't my responsibility? But there's always a gate. And I am the gatekeeper of my heart. I choose who I invite in and who I don't. A lot of the best conversations people can have is at the fence line, over the fence. Not inviting somebody in and then trying to have a conversation. Now, the metaphor, what does that mean? What it means is they have their heart, I have mine. Let's try to compare and talk over the fence line about what's going on in each person's heart. That's it. But the fence line is clear. Who's responsible for what? And I can see that maybe they are minimizing a crushing weight, which people a lot of times do when they get traumatized. The only way they can, remember John said about controlling the pain, the only way they can control the pain is either by relativizing it, comparing it to somebody else, or minimizing it. Those are the two things that people tend to do. So what does that mean? When I'm talking to somebody over that fence line about the stuff that they're dealing with, maybe they had somebody die in their life or some tragic thing has occurred in their life, and I perceive that this is a weight and they're making it sound like a backpack, I need to try to be encouraging, but still I'm going to have to be encouraging within limits. Because boundaries are important, because down the road, they're still going to have to come back to how do I care and watch over my heart. Okay? So, I want to talk about some specific boundary problems that people have. The thing that I want you to keep in mind when we talk about these is know, and put this in big letters in your notes. No one person is one of these. Okay? In a lot of cases, one person can be a couple of these depending on the kind of relationship that they're in. So keep that in mind. We are mixtures of that. In a lot of cases, you might have somebody who is one category or one profile here, and in a romantic relationship, they are something entirely different. And that's just part of how we handle things. So the first one is the compliant. And the compliants say yes to everything, good and bad. Greg would be a good example of that from the video. He says yes to everything. He never says no to anything. And why? You got to ask the motivation why. And some of it is one, I gain something by saying yes to everybody. I do. I'm needed. I'm useful. And as long as I'm useful, I used to have that as a motto. As long as I'm useful to somebody, I'm needed. And that's part of the motivation to say yes. The other part of the motivation is I don't want anybody to feel bad when I say no. It's probably the most fundamental boundary word in our vocabulary is the word no. It is also, for a lot of people, it feels isolating, and it also feels alienating. And yet, it defines me and not me, and that's why it's important. So compliance say yes to everything. They have indistinct boundaries. Their fence line, there is no fence. There's a fence line, but it is negotiable in every instance. Their tendency is to minimize the differences that they have with other people. And they think that by minimizing the differences that they draw closer to people. And it's an illusion, because the closer I draw to people and even fuse with people, I lose what? Me. I lose me. So my capacity to actually meet another's needs is diminished because I'm not me. I don't have my own resources. I only have resources when I'm connected with somebody. I only know who I am when I'm connected to somebody. And so the driving force behind all of this is fear. The one thing that you guys that are in Shame and Grace probably have read as the fundamental driving force behind shame is fear of disconnection. That's equally true here. That is equally true here. So you have the compliance. The other group, we've got 4 groups. The other group, another group is the avoidance. They say no to everything. They say no to good. When people offer to help and your propensity is to say, no, I'm fine. I can do it myself. There's an avoidant thing going on there. Doesn't mean you do it all the time, but they tend to relativize their problems. And so, what right do I have to complain because X, Y, or Z has it worse than I do? And the irony is an avoidant will always be able to find somebody worse off than them. Always. So they relativize their problem. They can't ask for help. And in their case, boundaries turn into walls. They're not a fence. They're not a fence. They're a wall. They're to separate people. Again, the question is, what's behind this? It's still fear, but it's the fear of being dependent. Or the fear of feeling dependent might be a better way to put it. Is they don't like feeling obligated to somebody. And so they always keep the ledger to their credit. Always. And they won't ask because they don't want to feel obligated. Now, when you think in those terms, that's contractual. In other words, I do for you if you do for me. And if I do, X to the 10th power, then I expect you to do X to the 10th power for me. So we forget the whole idea of covenantal relationships at all. That I give because I've been given to, and I give irrespective of whether I get something back. But avoidance don't work that way. And they're constantly fighting to not feel, and a lot of this is feeling, not feel obligated to other people. And so they don't ask. And for a long, long time, I was the poster child for this one. Because I grew up an only kid. And I always was alone. And I never had anybody, not to spin a pity tale here, but I didn't have anybody, so I just learned how to do it myself. And when people would come along and offer, I'd say, no, that's okay, I can handle it. Even though I couldn't. I knew I couldn't. I knew I wanted to help. But if I asked, I would feel in debt to somebody, and I didn't like that feeling, and it was worse. So the third group is the controllers. The controllers don't respect anybody's boundaries. We have a subset or 2 different types here. To them, when somebody says no, that it is simply a challenge to overcome. So either talk them out of it, manipulate them out of it, make them feel guilty, do whatever is necessary to get their no to turn to a yes. Ultimately, when they're feeling uncomfortable, when they're feeling bad in whatever way, it's other people's problem. They need to do something to help me. So they resist taking responsibility for themselves. And in most cases, they project responsibility onto other people around them. Now, controllers come in 2 different flavors. The first flavor is the one that we can see, coming across the bridge over there, from the other side of the pond. The aggressive controllers. We can see these guys a mile away. They are intimidating. They are manipulative in the open, so they don't hide it. They run over fences. They are dominating. They play the power card. They play I know more than you card. I'm more important than you card. Whatever you want to call it. They are the aggressive controllers. When things start going south, they get more and more escalated in their verbal abuse, sometimes even physical abuse. What we will see when we talk about domestic violence, for example, we'll see this pattern. We will see this pattern. In a lot of cases, in a lot of the scenarios that we're going to be looking at across the semester, a lot of the underlying stuff is about boundaries. It's about boundaries. So at least as far as they're concerned, nobody has a right to say no to them. Nobody does, yeah.
So if, like, with the avoidance of fear comes from, like, being dependent on someone,
Right.
and there's, like, fear, the compliance too, where does, like, the aggressive controller's fear come from? Why are they so like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the fear, again, is kind of a overblown level of connection that they think they're entitled to. So the word entitlement comes out with controllers. And so they're entitled to your attention. They're entitled to you taking care and doing the things that they ask you to. You're not entitled to say no or to have boundaries. I mean, again, like I said, when you hear no, it's somebody that's displaying boundaries. And that's a fundamental part of any relationship at all. The most intimate relationships are the ones that are clearest on their boundaries. They are. I mean, and some of you guys have heard me say this before, but when my daughters were at dating age, I said to them consistently, not that they listened to me, but I said to them consistently that if you say no to anything to a guy that you're going out with and they don't respect it and try to talk you out of it, call me. And either I will get you out of it or I will get him out of it. So that's what no is that important. It really is. And it's an important part of this. So aggressive controllers we can see coming a mile away. You may have had it in a workplace. A lot of times people will say the person abuses their power. It's aggressive controllers. The key thing about aggressive controllers they're way more honest. They don't hide it because manipulative controllers are always working underneath. Always getting you to doubt what you think is true or what you think you want to do or whatever. In a lot of cases, they're interpreting to you what you're thinking. Like they know. But we buy it. So they're less honest than the aggressive controllers are. The aggressive controllers aren't hiding it. But manipulative controllers are, and they just try to persuade you out of your boundaries. And they're unrelenting. They figure that they can outlast you. Outlast your no. No. Oh, come on. It's not that big of a deal. No. You're being a baby. Or you're being a straight edge. Whatever it is. No. Okay. Then we're not friends. Okay. Bye. So they try to persuade you out of your no, and they manipulate circumstances into something that isn't. We're told that the way things really are, we're not really seeing them very clearly. And so they manipulate our view of circumstances, maybe not the circumstances themselves, but they start to question. They get us questioning about how we actually see things. They're crazy making. I mean, you might be sitting there going, oh, crap, this is my family. Yeah, there's a lot of families that are crazy making like this because one thing is true, dad is verbally abusive with mom, and they're saying, oh, we're just having strong words. What the heck ever? I'm using words to beat the snot out of your mom. The person's not going to say that, right? So they mystify and they change and they manipulate how you look at things and they say it's not really what you think it is. That's the manipulative controllers. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, it's like, have you run into people who try to use like logic to beat you around like?
Oh yeah, that would be in this category too.
Yeah, they're like, oh.
Yeah, they logic you out of it. It's still a persuasion. Yeah, they'll use the emotional side just to get you feeling sorry for them or whatever. Or they might logic you out of it and turn you into 1,000 little knots and you say, okay, enough. I can't think, my head hurts. I'm done. And then you say, yes. And the odd thing about it is you withstand and withstand and withstand and then finally say yes. What are you communicating to these people? you don't really mean no anyway. All they have to do is wait you out. All they have to do is change your mind, whatever that might be. I say that in parenting all the time when I talk to parents. Is if you're going to set a limit, whatever that limit is, you better stick to it, because if you cave on it, your kid will figure it out and say, oh, well, if I just keep on, and if I keep pushing, then eventually they'll just say yes. And this is where these patterns develop. This is where these develop, is in the context of the family. The fourth group is the non-responsives. And they don't hear the needs of other people. They're the ones that are pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get over it, and get on with it. In one of my daughter's more cynical times, she used to say, cry me a river, build a bridge, and get over it. And that's kind of the non-responsives. It's I don't want to hear how bad it is for you. And if anything, I will evaluate how bad it is for you, and I'll be the judge of whether that's really bad or not. And usually it's never that. So instead of, when we talked about the avoidance relativizing their problems, non-responsives relativize everybody else's problems. And so they have a very critical spirit. They are absorbed in their own world, and everybody else is an intrusion into that world. So other people's needs, other people's wants, all of that is an intrusion. They have their ways of doing things, and they will stick to their ways of doing things. And if somebody doesn't respond well to it, it's their fault. I had a lady who was in a small group that I led, and some of you guys have heard me tell this story before. And she was a non-responsive. She was a very spiritual non-responsive. She was really good at it. But we had one lady that was in the group. She was in her mid-40s, never married, never divorced, and just hadn't found the significant relationship she'd hoped for. We were approaching the holidays, and she was expressing what a lot of singles feel around the holidays. No family, and the loneliness comes, and just being alone and lonely. And one of this lady in my group decided that she was going to bless her with some spiritual encouragement. And she was non-responsive. She was not hearing her needs, the other lady's needs. She was hearing what she needed to say was important. So she says, just remember you're the daughter of Jesus and you are loved. That's all I could do to sit on my tongue. And I waited. I was very patient. I waited and waited to see how the other lady would respond. And I began. The first thing I saw when that lady said that, she was this non-responsive. She wasn't hearing what she needed. Her head dropped. And she said, yeah, you're right. And I said, I couldn't hold myself back any longer. And I said, I looked at her and I said, does that really help? Did that really help you at all? And this lady went ballistic. Absolutely ballistic. She came back at me, hammers and tongs, said, you mean to tell me you're telling me I can't tell somebody is loved by Jesus? You don't want to know my answer. I said, yeah, I am. I said, the moment your need to say it is more important than the need of the person you're speaking to, it's not what you think it is. And she continued to lose it. Left the house, went out to our car, fell into a temper tantrum or whatever it was she was in. And, God love my wife. She's already kind of come through her own codependency, but boy, it came out in Technicolor when that happened, because of course I was hurting somebody else and she didn't like that and everything else. And so we ended up having a bigger boundary discussion in our kitchen after they all left, and she began to realize that I was protecting the person from somebody like this. And she initially didn't see it because all she saw was the emotional kind of chargedness of that, and I'm not very intimidated by that. And she hadn't been in enough groups to really have much of that happen. And the thing that told me I did the right thing was that lady came up to me afterwards and looked me in the eye and said, "Thanks for protecting me." And I, it never occurred to me. I wouldn't ask it anyway. But if I were to have asked her, "What was I protecting you from?" And the bottom line is misapplied big T truth. Because you've heard me say over and over again, big T truth that is ill-timed is experienced like a weapon. And that was it. That was it. Was it true? Yes, it was true. Was it ill-timed? Horribly. Catastrophically. And it was in the needs of the speaker, which is what non-responsives tend to do. Is this... They are absorbed with their own needs. The need to be profound, the need to say something important, the need to feel like they're helping is more important than the needs of the person that they're talking to. And that's a non-responsive. That's what non-responsives do. So they tend to spiritualize, in the Christian world at least, they tend to spiritualize and have every kind of spiritual answer. That is true. Nobody's going to debate that. But it's ill-timed. It's very ill-timed. So, if you want to graph this, if you're more into tables, I'll give you tables. The four groups of people fall into who can't say no, who can't hear no, who can't say yes, and who can't hear yes. So, who can't say no? Pop quiz. Compliance. Who can't hear no? The controller. Or both flavors, okay? Who can't say yes? Anybody know that one?
No, the last one.
Those two come together, okay? Because no, you're right. I got ahead of myself. You're right. The non-responsive can't say yes. Then of course, who can't hear yes is the avoidant. The avoidant, people are saying, let me help you, and they say, no, that's okay. I can do it. So you're right. I always get those confused too. So so that's how those lay out. It gives you a little bit of a clue as to how it shows up. The danger is two things when I walk through this stuff with all of you guys. One is shame is waiting on your doorstep when you look at how you interact with people and say, oh crap, I'm that. And no one is that. Okay? No one is that. My pitch always is grace gives us a space to learn. Shame does not. And shame is waiting to convict us based on our behavior translated into how bad we are. And nothing bad can learn anything good. So, accepting grace and embracing that allows me the capacity to say, instead of, oh crap, I say, oops, I didn't know that. I need to learn something new here. And I can try. I can try to do it better next time when I see it. But again, all of that is a learning thing. Grace is always going to be about growth. It's always going to be about growth. Shame is about perfection. And if you want perfection, go out to Michael's and buy yourself a tree. There's a perfect tree. But it's not growing. Okay? So, there are two other kind of broad areas that we have to talk about. These are kind of filling in the gaps. There are two different kind of issues. One's called functional boundary issues. The other is called relational boundary issues. The easy way that I explain this is if you tend to be more focused on getting a task done than the relationship you have with those around you, then you're more in this functional boundary issue area. If you're more focused on the relationship and not getting the task done, of course we can use relationship to distract us from getting tasks done. You guys would never know anything about that, right? Then we're in the relational boundary issues. A lot of times what you point to is the characters of Mary and Martha. Martha was very much of a functional boundary issue person. She was about getting the task done and fussing and moving around and everything else and trying to get Jesus to tell Mary to get off her butt and help her. And the flip side was Mary sitting at Jesus' feet, relationally connecting with him rather than getting something done. And even in leadership, when we talk about leadership styles, you can see leaders in this exactly the same way. Either they focus on task or they focus on the relationship. The ones that are really good find that area right in the middle that has the right level of relational contact and support and the right level of task orientation to get things done. Best leaders around. And those leaders are also very flexible to the needs of the people that they're leading. That was Jesus, by the way. Jesus was perfect in that respect because he treated his disciples all very differently. Even from situation to situation, he dealt with them differently. And when they needed a relational support, he provided it. When they needed to get hit upside the head with a 2x4, he didn't hold back. I think "Get thee behind me, Satan" is pretty much of a 2x4. So that's these issues, and they're broader and more people. It depends on the situation you're in. I get all that, but it's additional issues that tend to come out around that. Okay. Now, once we talk about this in the context of boundaries, the next natural application is about safe people. And whether or not we're safe people, and the question would be, how do you describe what a safe person is? And whatever comes to your mind, keep that, hold that, write it down, do whatever, in terms of how would we describe somebody who's safe. And more often than not, we describe them as safe in terms of how they impact us. That's how we tend to do that. So when you look at people's descriptions of safe people or unsafe people, they talk about they don't listen to me, they can't understand my struggles, they're distant, they're controlling, they're always angry, I'm my worst. See, all of it is our way of defining safety is always in terms of us and how they impact us. When God goes about describing unsafe people, he describes them in terms of what's going on in their heart. And this is the connection with what I said a minute ago about the wellspring of life. What's going on in their heart, unfaithful and far away, distant, proud and perfectionistic, unloving. See, he cuts past, and Jesus made that very clear. And God said it even to Samuel when he was trying to choose David, is God doesn't see the exterior, he sees the interior. And that's what he pays attention to. And we're called to learn how to do that too. I mean, when you want to think about or have, and we all know this from Scripture, right? Have the mind of Christ. That means discerning like Jesus did. Because I have to process information that way. So we have to talk about, inevitably, at least in this culture particularly, the difference between judgment and discernment. And a simple way to understand this is that discernment is detecting what's going on in somebody's heart. It is not judgment until I make a conclusion about what's good or bad about that. But being discerning about somebody also calibrates what? My boundaries. Discerning the nature of the person, what's going on within their heart, and discerning kind of the behavior and tracking it back to what could be going on in somebody's heart that would lead to this kind of behavior. Okay? For somebody that doesn't accept no for an answer, we say, I don't like that very much. Got it. But then the bigger question is what's going on in this person's heart that makes them so insensitive to other people's needs that no is an affront? That's a bigger issue. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about discernment. So when we choose friendships, we do it based on outward appearances. When we get into relationships, we experience the interior of the person. And so our descriptions tend to change. And when it comes right down to it, we don't have much training in discerning character because we've been so drilled with, don't judge anybody, don't judge, don't judge. So what do we do then? We don't do anything. We don't even discern the nature of the person that we're in a relationship with in whatever measure of closeness you want to use in that. Why is this so important when we're talking about it within crisis and trauma? I think all of us want to be safe people. I think we all do. We go into relationships doing that. But I'm not sure we have a definition very clear in our mind about what safety really is. And it all revolves around the heart of the person that we're talking about here. The behaviors take care of themselves if I take care of the heart stuff. If I take care of the well, the stream that comes out of that well will take care of itself. But if I spend all my time downstream with all the other things that are interfering with the stream, while good, it's not going to change the well. And that's the crux of the issue when we talk about being safe people for people that are in chaos. So what I want to do is, again, this is another group of people, okay? And again, I'll say it all over again. No one person is ever one of these. You might find that you're all of these at some point, depending on the relationship. So there's 3 different groups that we have to talk about. The abandoners, who begin with promises of companionship. I'll be your friend forever. And then when things get tough, or your flaws start showing, they're gone. As you probably have heard, abused people abuse people. Of course, that assumes that nothing has been done as a result of abuse. Abandoned people abandon people. They don't have any model to work from. And the reality is they're afraid of authentic closeness because it invites them to show themselves. And they have already made the conclusion about that self. And they have already made the conclusion for you about what you would do with that if you actually saw it. And how many of us have made that conclusion for other people? And it goes this way. If you knew me the way I know me, you wouldn't stick around. So therefore, I'll bolt first. And I'll leave the relationship first. So they leave a wake of people who don't trust relationships. And we've all experienced it on maybe both sides of this coin. And we say, I ain't trusting anybody ever again for the rest of my life. For good reason. For good reason. Which brings up a bigger issue, which some of you have heard me talk about when I talk about the stained glass self. My greatest protection is to create an appearance of me rather than the real me in order to deal with things. The one thing, if you'll notice when John was talking, he said when crisis occurs, people don't hide. It's like they're all there. And that's in a lot of ways, that's exactly what crisis tends to do. Is that it unveils people. If they have anger issues, they're destroying things. If they struggle with depression and shame and those sorts of things, then they're hunkering down and beating themselves up with if-onlys and I should have and I could have and all sorts of things. So those things tend to show themselves in a crisis situation. So the second group of people are what we call the critics. And these are people who take a parental role with everybody, telling them what their needs are and how to be responsible and all that kind of thing. They are very judgmental. They don't speak truth in love. They speak truth according to their needs rather than the other person's needs. And they really have no room for grace or forgiveness, even though they talk about it all the time. They talk about it all the time, but nothing about their behavior or relating has any grace in it or forgiveness in it. In most cases, when you bring a problem to somebody who's a critic, they are parsing your words for what is the error rather than connecting with you. And you walk away maybe with a great plan, but you don't walk away with feeling like somebody heard you. In a lot of cases, the critics confuse weakness with sinfulness. And therefore, they end up condemning others that have problems. Of course, they don't. Their job is really to help others figure out their own problems, which by implication says they don't have any. Now, you push on that, and they will admit they have some, but they'll go right back to helping you figure out your problem first. So what does that tell you? In a lot of cases, critics are so busy with other people's problems to distract themselves from their own. And let me draw you back to something John said. He said people get into advocacy for a lot of different reasons. And the people that are getting into advocacy so to meet their own needs are the ones that burn out because of boundary issues. The people that get into advocacy to come alongside of people and allow them to feel connected with and allow them to feel like they're human in spite of what just happened to them, those people persist because they're clear about where they end and somebody else starts, and they're about empowering the other person. They're asking the kinds of questions that help them kind of get their orientation back and everything else. So that's the critics, okay? The last group is who we would call the irresponsibles. And these people are an absolute blast to be around. They are the life of the party. They are the ones that if you have an impulse that you say out loud, they're the ones that are saying, do it. They're not much at delaying gratification. They don't consider consequences of their behavior or their actions. And oftentimes they will not follow through. They'll make promises they don't keep. Now, that sounds vaguely familiar to some of the other people we talked about. And that's why I say safe people and boundaries fit very closely together. Because I'm not going to make a promise that I can't keep. The worst part about it is that when we make a promise, we do it to allay somebody else's feelings, but they take it as a promise. There might be another way to allay somebody else's feelings than making a promise. That's my point. And that's what is important. So oftentimes if you're drawn to irresponsible people, you will see certain behaviors. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. You pick up after them. You apologize to others for them. Oh, they didn't mean it. They're having a bad day. They're tired. Make excuses for them. Give them a chance after chance after chance. Nag them. Nagging is an interesting thing. It's a veiled form of anger. I'm really pissed at you, but I'll just make you miserable by nagging you. Maybe then I'll get you to do something. Or we just simply resent them. Naggers are oftentimes resentful. So sometimes we can tell that we're in a relationship with somebody who tends to be pretty irresponsible by these kinds of behaviors we see in us. And how that actually looks. All right. Let me stop a second and let you breathe. Hopefully you'll have plenty to think about. Any questions at all? Yeah.
Do you think that the critics, you said like they can't face their own problems, but do you think sometimes like they are so critical of others because they're so critical of themselves?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They are reflecting what they're already doing. So they fling outside of them whatever they're doing internally. Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. Any other questions or anything? We have one more installment, and then we're done, and we'll get back to crisis and trauma. You go from the frying pan into the fire, I think is what that's called. So we'll look at the personal and interpersonal traits, and then we'll talk about how to be a safe person next time, and then we'll call it a day with the rest of that material, okay? See you then.
Yeah.